Watching News at Prime, let's get into another important conversation as we continue to build our coverage on the upcoming B20 events. This is all in the lead up to this weekend's G20 Leaders Summit. Now, renewable energy service provider SCATEC says it will be using its participation to advance Africa's energy transition. Here to tell us how they'll be doing that, we're joined by SCATEC's EVP of Sub-Saharan Africa, Alberto Gambacorta, who talks to us about energy matters now. Alberto, good evening to you. Thank you very much for making time for us. How important is the G20 a platform not only to advance energy transition, but also to end energy poverty on the continent of Africa?
Good afternoon, Xoli. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon to the viewers as well. Thanks for having me on the show this evening. So the B20 is bringing together the business, the finance, and the policy leaders from around the world. Central or part of the topics that we discussed is the energy transition, innovation, infrastructure, investment in Africa, the place where it's most needed. This will help raise awareness on the challenges and the opportunities that the country faces. One of them you've mentioned already, being energy poverty. And I'm confident, I'm hopeful that this conversation will help attract more investments and more innovation in the continent. In a way, this B20 offers a unique chance to shift the narrative from a potential to actually a pipeline, from scarcity to opportunity.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk then about the challenges, because you mentioned this at the start of your response. What are the challenges that confront not only the continent of Africa, but indeed the world over?
Let me talk about the continent and Africa as a potential renewable powerhouse in the making. Let's take a few facts and figures, which I always like. So Africa will be home to the largest workforce in the world by 2050. You're talking about hundreds of millions of youngsters coming to age and starting working. This means there will be an enormous demand for energy powering households, businesses, digital needs and infrastructure. Now, the opportunity, the challenge is clearly how do we deliver? How do we bring energy to this enormous workforce? Second is how do we do it in a reliable, affordable, sustainable, and at pace with what is needed. And here is where the great story of renewables is. Renewables are able to bring sustainable, affordable, reliable electricity to the continent. The investment required is in the range of about $190 billion per year, according to the International Energy. Yeah. Now, this is a challenge, but at the same time is an enormous opportunity to see Africa as an engine of the energy transition.
All right. There are two interesting thoughts that I've really taken away from this particular response. First of all, you talk about Africa being the energy powerhouse in the making. We'll revisit that in a moment. But you also talk about renewables that are reliable. There's been a big argument in South Africa, particularly with our crisis of the energy utility, our energy utility Eskom, and many critics of renewables saying they are not reliable. How do you convince a country like South Africa that renewables are reliable?
Thank you. That's a great question, Xoli. And I'd like you to just, I'm pointing at the background light behind me. So this is a project called Kenneth, and it's the first example of a project in the continent, a hybrid project, which is solar plus battery storage. And it's the first time that renewables coupled with storage were able to compete with fossil fuels. Now, what this power plant does, it's going to provide reliable energy for 16.5 hours per day for 20 years. And it's entirely powered by the sun, and part of the electricity will be stored in batteries. So the whole narrative of the intermittency of renewables, it's clearly a fact. They are intermittent. But coupled with batteries, and the prices of which is going down dramatically, will make it possible for the adoption of renewables in a reliable way. As a matter of fact, the power plant that you see in my background is a dispatchable facility, meaning that Eskom is at liberty to inject on the grid whenever they want, the capacity that it provides.
Yeah. Let's then talk about Africa being the energy powerhouse in the making. Make me believe in that statement. What are we talking about going into the future?
So what we're talking about, I think that the numbers are clearly staggering in terms of the megawatts and the gigawatts that are going to be needed. Here, it's really about providing electricity. At the moment, the continent still has about 600 million people that don't have access to reliable electricity. So this is the opportunity, the challenge and the opportunity. The powerhouse in the making is, in our view, is a quite simple concept. Africa needs top innovative solutions to power its needs. And this comes from what the energy transition affords us, which is renewables, of course, first and foremost. That the ability to deploy renewables at pace is part and parcel of the solution. You need to power the continent and give access to very remote areas. And this can only be done with solutions that are flexible, easy to deploy, and there is also appetite to finance this type of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And renewables are positioned greatly.
Let's conclude the conversation on this point, and that is that for you who is championing the renewable energy space, for you to have a solid buy-in, you need to convince policymakers. It may not be in South Africa only. In fact, the opportunity exists here and now at this G20. How do you convince them that indeed this is the way of the future when you have a COP30 conference that is ongoing right now in Brazil that's not attended by the United States, for example? And this is a world power. There's a push and pull there. And part of it has to do with the energy space, because there are those who are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, even though they are developed nations of the world.
It's a great question, Kalani. So I think it's important to clearly highlight that this push to build more renewables is in a way unstoppable. You have the support right now of the finance community that wants to invest in this asset class. You have a large demand for this type of infrastructure, and policymakers are actually already taking the steps needed to enable this type of investment. So we've seen that in South Africa, we've seen that across the continent. We are present in Egypt, we're present in Botswana as well. And we see that more and more policymakers are realizing that this is actually the path of fastest deployment of the much needed energy infrastructure. We also see that more and more the public-private partnerships are coming to the fore to help deploy other type of infrastructure, such as a transmission infrastructure, which is required to bring these electrons from one part to the other of the country. So policymakers are already at work, and they don't need to be convinced. They already know that this is much needed and this is the future. What we need is, and we hope that B20 will bring this conversation to the fore, is to reduce the amount of barriers that some of these policies or the regulatory frameworks in general across the continent present for developers, and to make sure that capital will flow to these projects.
Alberto Gambacorta, thank you very much for your time this evening. He is the Executive Vice President of the Sub-Saharan Africa Division of SCATEC.